David had always been proud of his fighting skills. For 15 long years, he trained hard in martial arts. Every morning at 6, he was at the gym. Every evening, he practiced his moves. His walls were covered with certificates and medals from different competitions. 3 black belts hung in his living room like trophies. People in his hometown knew him as the guy who could break wooden boards with his bare hands. Kids would gather around when he practiced in the park. Their eyes would go wide when they saw him kick and punch. David loved the attention. He felt like a real-life action hero. His friends often joked that he could probably take on anyone. David never disagreed. Deep down, he believed it too. After winning so many local tournaments, he started thinking he was unbeatable. The confidence felt good, but it was slowly turning into something else. Pure arrogance. When David decided to visit London for his vacation, he had big plans. He wanted to see all the famous places he had heard about. The Tower of London, big. Ben, and of course Buckingham Palace. He had seen the royal guards in movies and TV shows, those tall guys in red uniforms with the big black hats. They looked cool, but David wondered if they were actually tough. On his first day at the palace, David stood with hundreds of other tourists. Everyone was taking pictures of the guards. The guards stood perfectly still, like statues. They didn't move, didn't blink, didn't even seem to breathe. David watched them for a long time. He noticed how they gripped their rifles, how they stared straight ahead, how they ignored all the noise around them. They're just for show, David thought to himself. Real fighters don't just stand around looking pretty. He had read somewhere that these guards were real soldiers. But looking at them now, David found it hard to believe. They seemed more like actors in a play. Sure, they looked serious, but David had never seen them actually do anything. In his mind, real fighting happened in rings and dojos, not while standing guard at a palace. David's martial arts training had taught him to read body language. He could usually tell if someone was dangerous just by watching how they moved. But these guards weren't moving at all. To him, that meant they probably couldn't move well when they needed to. The more David watched, the more convinced he became. These guys spent their days standing still and looking important. Meanwhile, he spent his days actually fighting and training. The difference seemed obvious to him. Other tourists seemed impressed by the guards. They whispered about how disciplined and professional they looked. But David saw something different. He saw people who had probably never been in a real fight. People who had never felt the rush of actual combat. As the days passed, David kept coming back to watch the guards. Each visit made him more curious and more confident. He started wondering what would happen if one of these guards actually had to fight. Would they know what to do? Or would they freeze up like most people do when things get real? David had no idea that his curiosity was about to get him into the biggest trouble of his life. By his third visit to Buckingham Palace, David felt like he knew these guards personally. Even though they never moved or spoke, he had been watching them for hours. He knew which one stood at which post. He knew when they changed shifts. He even knew which guard seemed the tallest and strongest. Today felt different, though. David woke up feeling extra confident. He had just finished his morning workout and felt pumped up. The endorphins from exercise were flowing through his body. He felt like he could take on the world. Walking up to the palace gates, David noticed the same guard from yesterday. The man stood perfectly straight, eyes forward, holding his rifle. He looked to be in his 30s, with a serious face and strong build. David decided this was his chance to satisfy his curiosity once and for all. "Excuse me," David said, stepping closer to the guard. The man didn't even blink. David waited for a response, but got nothing. This only made him more determined. "I've been watching you guys for days," David continued, his voice getting a bit louder. "I'm curious about your training. I'm a martial artist myself. Been doing this for 15 years. Still nothing." The guard stared ahead like David wasn't even there. Other tourists started to notice the one-sided conversation. Some pulled out their phones, thinking something interesting might happen. David felt his face getting red. He wasn't used to being ignored. Back home, people always listened when he talked about fighting. They respected his experience. But this guard was treating him like he didn't exist. "Look, I'm not trying to cause trouble," David said, stepping even closer. "I just want to know if you guys actually know how to fight, or if you're just for decoration." A few tourists gasped at his boldness. David heard someone whisper, "Is he really challenging a royal guard?" This gave him an idea. If he was going to do this, he might as well do it right. "I've got black belts in 3 different martial arts," David announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I've won tournaments. I've trained with some of the best fighters in my country, so I'm genuinely curious. What kind of combat training do you palace guards actually have?" The crowd was growing now. More people stopped to watch. David loved having an audience. It reminded him of his tournament days when crowds would cheer for his victories. The guard, whose name tag read Morrison, still hadn't moved a muscle. His eyes remained fixed on some invisible point in the distance. His breathing was so controlled that his chest barely moved. To David, this looked like weakness disguised as discipline. "Come on, man," David said, frustration creeping into his voice. "At least acknowledge that I'm talking to you. Are you even allowed to speak, or are you too scared to admit you don't know how to fight?" Some tourists looked uncomfortable now. They could sense that David was crossing a line, but others seemed excited to see what would happen next. Phones were definitely recording now. David's ego was fully in control at this point. The lack of response felt like disrespect. In his world, when someone challenged you, you either backed down or stood up. This silent treatment was something he had never experienced. "I'll tell you what," David said, his voice now loud enough for the whole crowd to hear. "How about we settle this like real fighters? Nothing violent, just a friendly demonstration of skills. Show me what kind of training they give you palace guards." The tension in the air was thick now. Even the other guards seemed to be paying attention, though they didn't move their heads. David felt like he was on stage, performing for an audience. This was his moment to prove that real fighters were better than ceremonial soldiers. He had no idea he was about to learn the hardest lesson of his life. David's patience finally snapped. He had been talking for 10 minutes straight, and the guard hadn't even blinked in his direction. The crowd was getting bigger, and David felt like he was losing face. In his mind, this silent treatment was the worst kind of disrespect. "Fine," David said through gritted teeth. "If you won't respond with words, maybe you'll respond to this." What happened next would replay in David's mind for years to come. He reached out and gave the guard's shoulder a light push, not hard enough to hurt anyone, just enough to get a reaction. In David's world, this was how you called someone out. It was a universal sign that said, "Let's see what you've got." The moment David's hand touched Morrison's shoulder, everything changed. Time seemed to slow down as David watched the guard's eyes shift. For the first time in 3 days, Morrison looked directly at him. But there was no anger in those eyes, no surprise, no fear. Just cold, professional calculation. What followed happened so fast that most of the crowd missed it. Morrison's body moved like a machine that had suddenly been turned on. His left hand came up and trapped David's extended arm. His right hand shot forward in a controlled strike that hit David right in the center of his chest. David felt the air leave his lungs in a rush. Before he could even process what was happening, Morrison stepped to the side and used David's own momentum against him. 1 second, David was standing confidently. The next, he was falling backward with no way to stop himself. The impact with the ground knocked what little breath David had left completely out of him. He lay there gasping like a fish out of water, staring up at the gray London sky. His ears were ringing, and he couldn't understand how he had ended up on his back. Morrison was already back in position, standing at attention as if nothing had happened. His rifle was in the exact same position. His eyes were looking straight ahead again. The only sign that anything had occurred was David lying on the ground nearby. The crowd that had been chattering excitedly just moments before was now completely silent. Phones were still recording, but nobody was making a sound. Even the pigeons seemed to have stopped cooing. David tried to sit up but couldn't quite manage it yet. His chest felt like it had been hit by a truck. Not because Morrison had struck him hard. The guard had actually used minimal force. It was the precision that shocked David's system. Morrison had hit exactly the right spot to disable him without causing serious injury. "Oh my God," someone in the crowd finally whispered. "Did you see how fast that was?" David's face burned with embarrassment as the reality of his situation sank in. He was a supposed tough guy lying helpless on the ground while the decorative guard stood calmly nearby. The phones that had been recording his confident challenge were now capturing his complete humiliation. Morrison finally moved again, but only to help David to his feet. The guard's grip was firm but gentle as he pulled David upright. When their eyes met, Morrison's expression was completely professional. No smugness, no anger, no satisfaction. Just a soldier doing his job. "You all right, sir?" Morrison asked quietly. These were the first words David had heard him speak. David nodded weakly, still trying to catch his breath. He wanted to say something, anything, to save face. But what could he say? That it was a lucky shot? That he wasn't ready? That the ground was slippery? None of those excuses would work because David knew the truth. He had just been completely outclassed by someone he had underestimated. The decorative guard had neutralized him so quickly and efficiently that David never even had a chance to use any of his 15 years of training. As David stood there catching his breath, he realized that his entire understanding of combat had just been turned upside down. This wasn't a tournament or a dojo. This was something completely different, and he was way out of his league. Standing there in front of Buckingham Palace, David felt smaller than he had ever felt in his entire life. His legs were still shaky, and his chest ached where Morrison had struck him. But the physical pain was nothing compared to what was happening in his head. The crowd around him had grown even bigger. Word was spreading that someone had just challenged a royal guard and lost spectacularly. David could hear whispers and see fingers pointing in his direction. A few people were still recording, probably already planning to post the video online. "Sir, I need you to step back from the guard post," a police officer said, appearing beside David. The officer's tone was firm but not aggressive. He had clearly dealt with situations like this before. David nodded and moved away from Morrison, who had returned to his statue-like stance. As he walked, David's mind was racing. How had he misread the situation so badly? How had he convinced himself that these guards weren't real soldiers? "What were you thinking, mate?" asked an older British man from the crowd. "Those guards are from elite military units. They're not actors in costumes." David felt his face burn even hotter. Elite military units? He had never heard that before. In all his research about London tourism, nobody had mentioned that the Royal Guards were actual combat veterans. "I didn't know," David mumbled. But the man had already walked away, shaking, his head in disappointment. A teenage girl nearby was showing her friend something on her phone. "Look, it's already got 50 likes, she said excitedly. David's stomach dropped as he realized his humiliation was going viral in real time. The Reich police officer guided David to a nearby bench. "Are you hurt, sir? Do you need medical attention?" "No, I'm fine," David lied. Physically, he really was okay. Morrison had been careful not to actually injure him. But emotionally, David felt like he had been hit by a train. "Can I ask what you were trying to accomplish back there?" the officer asked, pulling out a notepad. David struggled to find words. How could he explain that he had spent 3 days convincing himself these guards were fake soldiers? How could he admit that his ego had grown so big that he thought he could challenge anyone? "I'm a martial artist," David started, then stopped. Those words that usually made him feel proud now sounded pathetic. I don't know what I thought." The officer nodded sympathetically. "Look, I see this happen more often than you'd think. Tourists get curious about the guards and sometimes push boundaries. But these men are real soldiers, sir. They've served in combat zones around the world. The ceremonial uniform doesn't change what they're trained to do. Combat zones, real soldiers, elite units." Every word hit David like another punch to his ego. He had challenged someone who had probably faced actual life-or-death situations, while David had only faced opponents in padded rings with referees watching. "Am I in trouble?" David asked, dreading the answer. "Not this time," the officer said, kindly. The guard reported that you seem to be testing boundaries rather than trying to cause real harm. Just don't let it happen again. As the officer walked away, David sat alone on the bench watching Morrison stand guard. The man looked exactly the same as he had an hour ago. Perfectly still, perfectly focused, perfectly professional. David wondered what was going through Morrison's mind. Was he thinking about the incident at all? Or had it been so routine for him that he had already forgotten about it? People continued to walk by and stare at David. Some looked amused. Others looked disgusted by his behavior. A few tourists asked if he was the guy who challenged the guard. Each question made David want to disappear into the ground. His phone buzzed with notifications. Friends from back home were already sending him links to videos of his encounter. The internet worked fast, and his moment of stupidity was spreading across social media platforms around the world. David realized that this wasn't just the embarrassing vacation story he would eventually laugh about. This was a fundamental shift in how he saw himself and his abilities. Everything he thought he knew about fighting and toughness had just been proven wrong in front of hundreds of people. The worst part was knowing that he had brought this entirely on himself. The video went viral faster than David could have imagined. Within 6 hours, martial artist challenges royal guard and instantly regrets it had been viewed over 1 million times. By the end of his first day back home, it had reached 10 million views across different platforms. David's friends tried to be supportive, but he could see the mixture of amusement and secondhand embarrassment in their eyes. His social media accounts were flooded with comments ranging from laughing emojis to harsh criticisms of his arrogance. Some people defended him, saying everyone makes mistakes, but the majority were not so kind. Dude thinks his dojo training makes him tough enough to challenge real military, read one popular comment. This is what happens when fake confidence meets real experience. The comment stung because it was completely accurate. David had confused his tournament success with actual combat readiness. He had mistaken controlled sparring matches for real fighting ability. 3 days after returning home, David finally worked up the courage to visit his martial arts instructor, Master Chen. The old man had taught David for over a decade and had become like a father figure to him. David knew he had to face this conversation no matter how painful it would be. Master Chen was sitting in his usual spot when David arrived, a small chair beside the training mats where he observed his students. The gym was empty except for Xiao, the two of them. I saw the video, Master Chen said before David could speak. David's heart sank. If his teacher had seen it, then everyone in the martial arts community probably had too. His reputation was ruined. I'm sorry, Master Chen, I brought shame to our school. The old instructor was quiet for a long time, studying David's face. Tell me what you learned, he finally said. David had expected anger or disappointment, but Master Chen's calm response caught him off guard. I learned that I'm not as good as I thought I was. That's only part of it, Master Chen replied. What else? David thought carefully before answering. I learned that there's a difference between sport fighting and real combat. That guard had training I couldn't even recognize. Master Chen nodded. The Royal Guards are selected from the best soldiers in the British military. Many have served in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other conflict zones. Their training is designed to disable threats quickly and efficiently. Your training is designed to win points in controlled competitions. This distinction had never occurred to David before. All his life he had thought fighting was fighting. A black belt was a black belt. But now he understood that different types of training produced completely different types of fighters. I've been teaching martial arts for 40 years, Master Chen continued. And the most important lesson I try to teach is humility. Physical techniques are easy to learn, but respect, wisdom, and understanding, these things take much longer to develop. David felt tears forming in his eyes. I feel so stupid, Master Chen. I thought I was this great fighter, but I was just a bully who picked on the wrong person. Good, the old man said, which surprised David. Feeling stupid means you're finally learning. For years, I watched your ego grow with each tournament win. I tried to teach you humility, but success made you deaf to those lessons. Master Chen stood up and walked to the wall where David's tournament trophies were displayed. These medals taught you that winning makes you better than other people. But that guard taught you something more valuable, that there's always someone better, always something more to learn. Over the following weeks, David's approach to martial arts completely changed. Instead of focusing on how to beat opponents, he studied how to understand them. Instead of training to show off his skills, he trained to develop his character. He started reading about different types of combat training. Military combatives, police defensive tactics, and reality-based self-defense were all completely different from tournament fighting. Each had its own purpose and methods. Most importantly, David learned to ask questions instead of making assumptions. When he met other martial artists, he asked about their training rather than bragging about his own. When he watched movies or videos of fighters, he looked for what he could learn rather than what he could criticize. The viral video never really went away. Even months later, people would sometimes recognize David and ask if he was that guy who challenged the guard. But instead of feeling embarrassed, David started using these encounters as teaching moments. "Yeah, that was me," he would say. "And it was the best thing that ever happened to my martial arts training." 6 months after the London incident, David returned to competition. But this time he competed with a completely different mindset. When he won matches, he thanked his opponents for the learning experience. When he lost, he studied what his opponents had done better. His tournament record actually improved after London, but more importantly, his relationship with martial arts became healthier and more meaningful. The 3 seconds that changed David's life had taught him something that 15 years of training never could. That true strength comes from understanding your limitations, not from ignoring them.